I'm talking this evening about the nature of the mind, and more particularly where the mind is. For years and years, consciousness was more or less ignored by science. Even psychology tried to do without consciousness for a long part of its history. Science was simply outside the scientific, consciousness was outside the scientific agenda. But it's very much on the scientific agenda now, and it's one of the most exciting areas of frontier science and research.
I'm Ashok, your host for Global Lens, and we're going to have with us tonight Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a world-renowned biologist, natural scientist, philosopher, and author. He's written over 10 books and many, over 75 technical articles that have been published on a range of topics coming out of the animal kingdom and concerned with special powers of animals. His latest book has to do with the sense of being stared at and other aspects of the extended mind. And it raises profound questions about the nature of science and nature and perhaps a revolution in science. He's currently the Pero Warwick Research Scholar at Trinity College, Cambridge, and holds a number of other positions, such as a Fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, as well as the Graduate Institute in Connecticut. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to Global Lens. Welcome, Rupert.
Pleasure to be here.
And help our viewers get started by understanding and situating your unusual research, because it's been also very controversial. We'll get to that later. But you speak of the extended mind. What does that mean, the extended mind?
I mean, the mind's not just confined to the inside of the head. A lot of people within institutional science at present believe that the mind is the brain. Mental activity is brain activity. It's all inside the head. I'm saying the mind is more like a series of fields based in the brain but stretching out beyond it. Just as magnetic fields stretch out beyond magnets and the fields of cell phones stretch out beyond the cell phone, so the fields of our minds stretch out beyond our brains. They're not all inside the brain.
Well, how did you come to this? This is an unusual approach given the state of the establishment field of science at this point.
Well, it may be unusual from the point of view of conventional science, but it's not unusual philosophically. I mean, after all, Plato believed this. Many philosophers have taken the view that the mind's more extensive than the brain, both within and beyond the body. I came to it through a whole range of phenomena that simply can't be explained in terms of the mind in the brain theory. This makes a lot more sense, I think, of the phenomena that we can actually observe and test and investigate scientifically. The question, though, the fundamental question is, where is the mind? And the conventional answer, which almost all of institutional science and medicine is based on, is that the mind is the brain. Mental activity is brain activity. It's all inside your head. We've all been brought up with that point of view. And it's very much taken for granted in our culture. It's the dominant paradigm. This became the dominant paradigm because since the 17th century, most Western thought about the mind has been split between two models, the dualist and the materialist. The dualists, following Descartes, the French philosopher, said that the mind is outside time and space. It's non-material, non-physical. And yet it mysteriously interacts with the brain in a small region of the brain, the pineal gland. Well, no one goes for the pineal gland anymore, but the standard dualist theory today is essentially the same, except the supposed seat of the soul has shifted a couple of inches into the cerebral cortex. But that, from a scientific point of view, if you say the mind is non-physical, has no physical effects except in this small region of the brain, and is totally outside space and time, there's nothing you can do with that scientifically. So the materialists say, well, if it doesn't do anything physically, we can just ignore it from the point of view of science, and in fact, just drop the whole concept. Then you slide into materialism. The mind is the brain. But that's so obviously unsatisfying that people then go back, say, well, surely dualism's more reasonable. Materialism doesn't correspond with our experience. And the strength of each of these positions is really the weakness of the other. So neither of them is satisfactory, but materialism is the most dominant at the moment. What I'm going to suggest is a third way of thinking about the mind that's neither materialist nor dualist, that treats the mind as a series of extended fields which are not just inside the brain but extend beyond it, and extend out, interconnecting us with each other and interconnecting us with the world around us.
Help share with our viewers a sense of some of these unusual phenomena that you've been concerned with.
Well, take the sense of being stared at, for example. Most people, about 90% of the population, have had the experience of feeling they're being looked at from behind. They turn around, someone's staring at them. Or else they look at someone and make them turn around by staring. Now, how does that work? If all your thoughts, everything you're seeing, it's all inside the brain, how could this influence someone at a distance and make them turn around? Now, of course, if they hear you, if you make a noise, then there's no problem. Everyone agrees that's a simple, straightforward thing. This happens even if you look at people through windows, for example, in a car, in a traffic jam. You stare at someone and they turn around. It's not just peripheral vision. Experiments that I've done and others have done show that this is a real ability. But it means that what happens in our mind through focusing our attention on something can actually influence something out there, showing that our attention and the mental activity isn't all confined to the inside of the head.
Right, so the only way to make sense of that, just common sense of it, there must be some way our minds are touching and influencing the wider environment.
Exactly, that's one of the things I mean by the extended mind.
But
yes.
starting in your early career as a natural scientist and biologist, you were concerned with animals and the animal behavior and so forth, weren't you? Is that how you started in? I know that your early work had to do with morphic resonance, and I'd like to talk about, you're known for that, and I'd like to talk about that.
Well, I started off in developmental biology, trying to understand how animals and plants develop their forms. A common idea in that area is the idea of morphogenetic fields, fields that shape the form of living organisms, a bit like invisible molds. Now, just like a magnet has a field around it, which, as well as in it, so living organisms may have such fields. This is an idea that a lot of people have had. It's not an original idea with me. But trying to understand how these fields evolved, I came to the conclusion there must be a kind of memory within them. Living organisms are historically conditioned. The form of organisms depend on what organisms have done in the past. Each species has a kind of memory. The idea of morphic resonance is that of a built-in memory in all of nature, really. Each species has a memory, each individual contributes to it and draws upon it. And morphic resonance is a name given to this memory process where similar things are influenced by previous similar things. The similarity happens through resonance. Resonance is a way in which similar things influence other similar things.
Yes.
And this is using the term resonance in a somewhat metaphorical way. Morphic refers to the word form. The Greek word for form is morphe.
Yes.
So morphic resonance is the resonance of forms, shapes, or patterns of organization.
Now, I know you've done experiments in human phenomena, mental phenomena, psychic phenomena that have been rather considered controversial. We'll get to that in a moment, but we all seem to have a sense that animals are keen instincts and all kinds of unusual powers. It's legendary that in terms of, say, the tsunami, animals seem to have picked up on this and escaped the danger. And so, you know, you're concerned with trying to make sense of that. That's a very common sense observation, isn't it?
Yes, there are a whole range of animal abilities which at present science ignores or marginalizes. I think that we need to look at these and try and understand what's going on. For example, premonitions. It's not just tsunamis, it's also earthquakes. A lot of animals seem to know when earthquakes are going to happen. They show signs of anxiety, distress. It happens with pets too. Cats will hide, dogs will be anxious. And the Chinese have actually used this as a way of forecasting earthquakes quite successfully.
Yes.
In the West, people ignore this animal behavior and can't forecast earthquakes. I think if we paid more attention to it, if we actually look at what the animals are telling us, even though we don't know how they do it, we could actually learn something from them and help to avoid a lot of these catastrophic losses of life.
When you come to human situation with telepathy and questions of ESP and these kinds of capacities or alleged capacities, there's a kind of a spooky area for scientific research, isn't it? You've had quite a bit of resistance to your work in this area.
Well, these are traditionally taboo topics within science. I mean, it's a ridiculous situation, really. We have the majority of the population believe that these things happen, not out of any ideology, but simply because they've experienced them. Lots of people have had a telepathic experience before phone calls. You think of someone who then rings. Within the institutional scientific world, there's been an attempt to deny or brush aside these phenomena. For example, if someone thinks of someone who then rings, the standard skeptical objection is, oh, well, you think of people all the time, you forget all the times you're wrong, and if someone rings, you think it's telepathy. It's a reasonable theory, but in science you need more than theories, you need evidence. And no one had, until I started doing research on this a few years ago, no one had ever even attempted to investigate this phenomenon experimentally. People were just satisfied with an armchair explanation. There is these things have traditionally been controversial. I think because some scientists are afraid that if you allow telepathy to occur, science as we know it, reason and so on, will be undermined, civilization will collapse. I mean, they have the most terrible fears. I think telepathy is a perfectly normal means of communication among animals. We have it because we're animals, not because we're spiritually advanced or something. It's an animal ability that dogs and cats have better developed than humans, or at least modern humans. So I think that the way forward is to study it in animals, as I have done, and in people, treating this as a normal, natural means of communication, not supernatural, not paranormal, but normal. And I think by doing that, we can enlarge the frontiers of science. By not doing it, we set up a zone of fear and discomfort and denial, which is very bad for science and very bad for all of us.
Well, really. I want to talk about this. This is, to me, very interesting and important for the future, because you've really encountered really severe criticism and skepticism regarding your work, or even acknowledging these kinds of phenomena as worthy of scientific investigation. I'd like to talk about, what have your critics been saying, for example? I know your latest book, The Sense of Being Stared At, has gotten a certain backlash in certain quarters. What kinds of things are your critics saying?
Well, there's two kinds of skepticism. There's reasonable, rational skepticism, which I'm a skeptic of that kind myself, I'd like to think. It's looking at evidence, looking critically at what's going on. I mean, that's part of the normal scientific method. There's another kind, though, which I think of as pathological skepticism. It's kind of dogmatic denial of anything that doesn't fit into some kind of ideological worldview. Now, those kinds of skeptics are very hard to deal with, because we're not dealing with evidence or science or reason. We're dealing with dogma and a fixed belief system. Recently, I was asked to have a debate on telepathy at the European Skeptics Congress in Brussels. There's a whole room absolutely full of skeptics, and I was pitted against the leader of the Dutch skeptics. And I presented the evidence for telepathy for half an hour. My own experiments and those of other people. There's a lot of it. It comes out, it's very positive. It shows that there are still areas unresolved, but the overall balance of evidence is in favour of its reality. My opponent didn't look at any evidence at all. He simply said on theoretical grounds telepathy is impossible. Therefore, all this evidence must be flawed or fake. And the more significant my results were, the greater the error there must be. So I said to him, well, can you point out what the error is? He said, I haven't looked at the data, I don't need to, because I know there's an error there somewhere.
So that's a kind of dogmatic skepticism.
It's dogmatic.
Unhealthy kind, not good for science.
That's not scientific. You see, science is about open-minded examination of evidence. That kind of skepticism is profoundly anti-scientific. We're supposed to have a common area of discourse in terms of hypotheses which can be tested and evidence. Those are the rules of science. I try to play by the rules. But there are people who think that there are certain areas that are taboo and off limits, and where the normal rules don't apply. And in the most narrow forms of skepticism, they'd apply that to every kind of telepathy, premonition, ESP type phenomena. The sense of being stared at, dismiss them all as illusions. Then it's difficult to have this dialogue, because the only way to enter into their way of seeing it is to enter into a kind of dogmatic belief system that says, essentially, we know what's possible. Science has already figured out the way nature works. It's just a matter of filling in details. But we know the basic outline of how nature is. My view is that there's still a huge amount we don't know about nature, and especially about the human mind. We have several hundred stories on the database from people about their cats. They say that their cat seems to pick up their intentions and seems to know when they're planning to take it to the vet. It disappears. Some people say that, after it happens a few times, they get so annoyed and upset by, it's so irritating having the cat disappear every time. They try to give the cat no clues. They don't let it see the carrying basket. They don't mention the word vet. They desperately try not to think of the vet. Some of them even call the vet from work so the cat can't overhear the conversation. And then they swing by to pick the cat up after work to take it to the vet. It's not there. We heard so many of these stories that we did a survey of the vets in the North London Yellow Pages. We called all 65 veterinary clinics and asked if they had a problem with people missing appointments with the cats. 64 out of 65 said yes, it happened all the time. And the one exception said it happened so often they'd given up an appointment system for cats. People just have to arrive with them. Of all the various forms of seemingly telepathic behavior with animals, the one that's easiest to investigate experimentally is the ability of that many dogs and cats and other animals have to know when their owners are coming home. When I discussed this with one of my skeptical friends at Cambridge, Nicholas Humphrey, a professor of psychology, to my surprise, he didn't deny the phenomenon. He said, "Oh, well, my dog used to do that. My mother always knew when I was coming home about half an hour in advance." So I said to him, "Well, it couldn't possibly have known by hearing your car engine from more than 20 miles away the other side of Cambridge." And he said, "Oh, on the contrary, it just shows what sharp hearing they've got." So this was the stimulus for this research, because both of us are scientists. We disagree on almost everything. But we do agree that the way to resolve disputes is through experiments. So I said, "Okay, what would happen if you came home by train, borrowed a bicycle, and cycled from the station so there were no familiar car sounds? Would the dogs still have known?" He said, "No, of course it wouldn't." And I said, "Well, maybe it would." And that's the basis of the experiment. Come home, go several miles away. People come home at non-routine times in unfamiliar vehicles, taxis, for example. We've now done hundreds of these experiments with dogs. And over again, they work. The dog goes and starts waiting. The most sensitive dogs go and start waiting when the person decides to come home, before they've even got into the taxi. It's the intention that they're responding to, not the sound of a car or the smell of a car engine, because in this case, in any case, it's an unfamiliar car. We've done literally hundreds of these tests. This research is summarized in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. And it's also published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And if you want to look at the details, the statistics is massively significant. You can look at them on my website, where the full texts of my papers are.
I'd like to talk about your experiments, because it's remarkable how you seem to get people out there in the culture involved in your experiments. Could you give us a sense of some of your recent experiments and how you involve people in the public to join in?
Well, I've been doing research on telephone telepathy, for example, knowing when someone's about to call. How those experiments work is that you have 4 callers. If you're the subject, you'd name 4 people you might be telepathic with. You'd sit at home being filmed with a landline phone in front of you. We pick one of the callers at random. They ring you up. Before you pick up the phone, you have to guess which of those 4 people it is. You can't know by any normal means, because we pick them at random. You may say, "I think it's Mary." You pick it up and say, "Hi, Mary." You're right or you're wrong.
You're not looking at the caller ID.
You're not looking, you have a caller ID free phone, and you can't do it on a cell phone because they all have caller IDs. That's why you have a landline. And by chance, with 4 callers, you'd be right one time in 4, 25%. We've done 1,000 of these trials. The average success rate is 42%. People aren't right every time, but it's way above the chance level. Highly significant
Something's
statistically.
going on, yeah.
And we've done a similar thing with emails, email telepathy. And I now have an online telepathy test on my website, which means anyone can do this kind of experiment.
So you welcome people to join in?
Oh, I invite them to. It's very much part of this research.
We'll post it, but what is your website?
It's www.sheldrake.org.
It's easy.
And on my homepage, there's the entry point to the online telepathy test.
I see.
This is free of charge. It's fun. It takes 10 minutes. You need 2 other people to do it with you.
Right.
And you'll get a rating at the end of how telepathic you are, and people can do it repeatedly and see if they get better, because you get feedback in these tests. It's a way of trying to improve.
What do you say to critics in the establishment science who might call this pop science or not rigorous? How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I would say that historically speaking, some of the best science we have was based on what ordinary people found and experienced. Charles Darwin, who's one of my heroes, based his research on, plant breeders, animal breeders, pigeon fanciers. It was based on the research of thousands of ordinary people who knew about animals and plants through practical experience. All those people have now been marginalized from biology, and it's confined just to what happens in labs. Now, I think that if we look at Darwin as a model of real science, it was based on this rich soil of experience that many people have. And when we're dealing with human phenomena like telepathy, then the best way to find out is to ask people what their experience is, to start from what's really going on in the world.
Right. We get a rush of respondents here because people have a fascination with this kind of psychic phenomenon. We all know something is going on in our own experience, don't we? Are you finding a warm reception in the public?
Well, I am, yes. And luckily, quite a number of students at colleges and schools have taken up this as the basis for projects. These make very good student projects because the tests are automated. I have several on my website that people can do. The randomization is all automated. So all the things that could lead to scientific problems if people don't know enough about the details of statistical techniques, that's all taken care of. So what people do is do the tests themselves, encourage others to do them, have groups of people who are tested. And this provides a fairly simple but profound way of doing scientific research, and means that students in schools and in colleges can actually be at the leading edge of scientific discovery.
Right, so they can join in your project, the students who are interested in
They certainly can, yes.
That's wonderful. Coming back to the subject we opened at the beginning about the extended mind, we talked about morphic resonance, but now, what is your understanding of the extended mind?
Well, the mind being extended beyond the brain.
I see.
The mind being more extensive than the brain, not simply confined to the inside of the head. I mean, philosophically, it goes back to the distinction that Descartes made in the 17th century. He said that matter's extended, the mind is not extended. Right. It's not in space and time at all. That led to a kind of impossible dualism. And one of the reasons so many materialists took up the view that the mind is the brain, nothing but matter, was precisely because that kind of dualism is so incredible. And it made a distinction that only matter's extended in space. I'm saying the mind's extended in space. When I see you, it's a conscious perception, and you're sitting there, not out of space, where consciousness is meant to be on the dualist view, but in space, a few feet from me.
So when we're perceiving each other in this way, our mind extends right out through our perception.
That's right. Our mind extends through our perception. That when I'm seeing you now, according to the conventional view, there's a little image of you somewhere inside my brain, a virtual reality display in my head that corresponds to you out there. What I'm saying is that my image of you is actually where it seems to be, where you're sitting. It's an image in my mind, constructed and interpreted by my mind, but it's not inside my brain, it's projected out.
That's amazing. So literally the mind is projected out into, it's extended out into...
Yes, in ordinary vision. Vision's a two-way process. Light comes in and images are projected out.
What does this imply? I mean, this is really in line with the great traditions that recognize a unified field of interconnectivity. Say the Hindu or the Buddhist view would see consciousness as connected, so that in some profound sense our minds are connected in a real... Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, that our minds are interconnected with each other and also with the environment around us. They're not hermetically sealed inside our skulls. And so I think this leads to a much more interconnected sense of our being in the world, the way we are and how we're related to each other.
Do you see science as at the cutting edge, moving more and more into this kind of unified interconnectivity field? You might get that impression from several of the books that are coming out now.
Well, you do from physics books, because physics has had to acknowledge this interconnectivity through quantum entanglement, through the role of the observer in making physical observations. In physics, this interconnection is recognized. In biology, it's still not, because paradoxically, many biologists are still trying to reduce the phenomena of life to the physics of the 19th century. They want biology to be explained in terms of classical physics, but as it were, the rug on which they're standing has been pulled from under them. Because physics is no longer 19th century physics, it's 21st century physics with quantum phenomena everywhere.
Right, well, time's just about up, and I'd like to just end by focusing on your current position as research scholar at Trinity. What is going to be your focus at this point?
Well, my work's now being funded by Trinity College, Cambridge, and the main focus is going to be on developing automated tests that can be done through the internet and in schools and colleges, so that large numbers of people can participate in this kind of research. Much more rapidly than if I were just doing it on my own in a laboratory somewhere. The more people that do it, the more rapidly it should be possible for the truth of this to be recognized, if indeed it's true. And that's what science is about: experiment, data, and replication.
Right. Now I'm just looking at your book titles, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, The Sense of Being Stared At. Is there another book in the wings coming at this point?
No, there isn't. At the moment I'm concentrating on research, and I'm writing scientific papers. And incidentally, if anyone wants to read them, they're all on my website in full text versions.
Right, and we've given them there, and we'll post that again for our viewers. Any final thoughts as you are going around lecturing now, aren't you?
At the moment I'm in the United States giving some lectures, yes.
Right, and but basically you'll be going back to Trinity, and that's where you'll be basically stationed for a while.
Well, I'm living in London, but I'm attached to Trinity College, Cambridge, and it's from London that I'm doing this work, yes.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here on Global Lens. You've really opened up our lens beautifully for the area of biology, nature, and science, and thank you very much. And I wish you all the best in your research, and I hope people will join you.
Thank you, and keep up the good work. It's great that you're doing this.
Thank you very much, Rupert. And thank you for watching Global Lens, and have a wonderful evening. Bye.